There's been a route over SHAP since the early Middle Ages. Certainly there are records from about the 12th century. The Bodleian or Gough map of the 14th century shows the road from Lancaster through Kendal to SHAP and Penrith. The road from Kirby Lonsdale through the Lune Gorge joins this road at SHAP, whilst the road from Appleby joins at Penrith. These are the only routes shown on the whole of this map of Cumbria.
It is a very old route. I mean, Bonnie Prince Charlie came through just 250 years ago, and the parish registers quite often record people, children born to a traveller on the fell, or a traveller found dead on the fell, and they've been buried here and that sort of thing. So it's, you know, I mean, it goes back quite a long way, these mentions of people on the fell.
SHAP, the township itself, probably owes its existence to being a convenient sheltering or resting place between Kendal and Penrith, which in the old days of driving cattle or whatever, or by virtue of the type of dirt roads there were, would be possibly an acceptable distance to travel. And consequently there were various hostelries sprung up, and then of course when the coach system started, we had at least 3 coaching inns with the facilities for horse changing and that sort of thing.
There are accounts of coaches getting stuck in the snow. I mean, there's one actual report that I have a copy of stagecoach, a mail coach in actual fact, getting stuck on the top of the fell in a bad snow, and they'd made the passengers get out and walk, and the coachman had actually taken the mail bags, taken the horses and galloped off to Kendal and left them abandoned on the fell, and they set off to walk back to SHAP where they thought there was a pub. And they said if any ladies had been in the company they probably wouldn't have survived the journey. But when they got back to SHAP they got holed up at somewhere like the Greyhound, and someone said to them after, well, what did you do? They were there about 10 or 12 days and there was no news in, news out or anything. I said, well, what did you do? Was there any books or anything? Well, no, not even a newspaper, no books or anything. Well, what did you do? Oh, well, the cockfighting morning, noon and night apparently. So they'd had plenty to occupy themselves. But so being stuck on the fell is quite an old story, you know, really.
Probably the greatest innovation insofar as the route was concerned was when the turnpike was made. And this section here is from Burton to Emmet Bridge. Quite a number of the dated milestones still survive, 1825. You know, the road had got to be better to keep the strict schedule of the coaches. Probably one of the biggest changes that came would be the coming of the railway, the opening of the Lancaster and Carlisle Railway in 1846. Because overnight it would seem, from various parish records, etc., that a lot of people who were employed in the horse-oriented industries, in other words, carters and blacksmiths and hostlers and one thing or another, were really had their livelihood threatened. But fortunately, again, according to parish registers, I use an example whereby the children of a family, father's occupation initially sort of pre-46 being given as a carter or something like that. When another child arrived and was baptised after say about 1850 or thereabouts, probably his occupation was given as a porter or a signalman or something of that ilk. The railway actually took quite a lot of business from the road at that time by virtue of the fact that it could be moved more smoothly and in bigger bulk all at one time. Motor transport came in about, say, the early part of this century, because I don't suppose many got round these parts in the 1890s.
The Turnpike Road was upgraded and eventually became the present A6 road. Of the 16 miles from Kendal to SHAP village, nearly 9 miles of the original route can easily be traced. Part of the road is tarmac, as it was used as a service road to the SHAP Aqueduct Tunnel, which was built to supplement the Manchester Aqueduct from Haweswater. Let's trace the route as we can see it today. From near the rear of the Plough Inn, just north of Sellside, it's now a bridle path. Just before Banisdale High Bridge, it's tarmac, and we can see the old Nissen huts that housed the snow ploughs. The bridges on this section date from the 17th century. From Banisdale High Bridge and after Thorne Cottage, the road takes a sharp turn left, skirts over the hill behind Forest Hall and comes out on the present A6 at Jungle Cafe. Just after the cafe, the road now branches to the left and climbs up the hill to pass left of Hollowgate Farm, then over the hill and down to High Borough Bridge. Various artefacts have been found over the years on this route, such as a Highlander's purse and cannonball, probably from the retreat of Bonnie Prince Charlie's followers on their journey north in 1745. The old road now follows Crookdale Beck, with the present high road up on our right. We now come to Crookdale Bridge at Hore's Foot, and the road climbs steeply from this point to the summit of the route. It crosses the present A6 near the summit, and then across the moors near SHAP Wells Hotel, through what is now the SHAP Granite Works, and rejoins the present A6 for the rest of the way to SHAP Village. The existing road is the old Turnpike Road, dating from 1764. This probably came into its own during and after the First World War. This was when goods were really starting to move by mechanical transport, which could of course carry much more than the pack horses, bullock carts and fly carts of the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 1920s, the road began to develop into a major route for commercial traffic between England and Scotland. At its peak, the road would be used by around 9,000 vehicles a day. So we can see it was of major economic and strategic importance to the economies of the north of England and Scotland. Now, with the help of some drivers and their vintage vehicles, let's take the journey on the A6 from Kendal to SHAP Village. As we leave Kendal on the A6, the road is straight and fairly flat. But within a couple of miles we come to a left-hand bend and immediately face the first of the climbs, up Strawberry Bank.
Yeah, that was sort of really the first bit of trouble as you were coming out of Kendal in winter, you know. There was a little cafe there on the left, Nannygot Junction we used to call it. There's always Nannygots tethered on the roadside.
The thing that was mostly known to drivers was that if you couldn't get over Strawberry, you couldn't go over SHAP, because Strawberry was actually steeper than Hawksbrow.
After climbing Strawberry Bank, we swing to the right and enter the district of Sellside and get scenic views across to Longsledale. From the Plough Inn, we climb, then drop down to Banisdale Beck, where we looked at the old road running parallel to the present A6 and crossing Banisdale High Bridge. Here we cross Banisdale Low Bridge. We swing round to the right here, then come over the brow of the hill at Forest Hall, round to the left and descend towards the site of the Jungle Cafe.
Well, the jungle has been there for many a long day, and it probably was a great haven for drivers, especially when weather was rough. And of course some were fortunate enough to be near enough hand to use it as such. Others weren't. But there were other places, you know, farmhouses were perfectly willing to help drivers out and give them something to eat and a roof over the head. But that was the main thing about the jungle, and it was the only place between Kendal and SHAP village.
My association with SHAP and the A6 goes back some 50-odd years. As a schoolboy I was a rock climber and mountaineer, and the very first opportunity I had to venture away from the rock climbing regions of the Peak District and North Wales was to come north on the old A6 by an arranged lift on London Scottish Transport. We left Manchester, it would be in the sort of 5 o'clock in the evening, in this big London Scottish wagon. I would say it would be about 3 o'clock in the morning. We were both asleep. The driver, who was a broad Glaswegian and had given up any attempt really to communicate with us because he found that we were not understanding his accent, climbed up SHAP from Kendal, and we reached the Jungle Cafe, where he said, "Do you want something to eat?" And we just about understood that this meant, did we want something to eat? And he took us into the cafe. And remember that this was a time of strict rationing. I mean, wartime was really worse than wartime conditions as far as rationing was concerned. And then he said, "Well, what do you want then?" So I said, "Well, what is there?" And he said, "Oh, it doesn't matter." He said, "Bring us 3 of your specials." And which she did, and this involved bringing 3 pint mugs of tea, 3 large wedges of bread with butter. Again, butter was on ration. And then followed 3 plates of the most enormous eggs, bacon, ham, the lot, which really was as much as one person would have had in a ration for a month. And we couldn't believe our eyes. And it was a fantastic meal.
A long straight climb now brings us past Hollowgate Farm, home of Lenore Knowles, whose family is part of the history of this section of road.
I'm Lenore Knowles, but previously I was Hook, and we live at Hollowgate, and of course everybody knows the Hooks of SHAP Fell, but unfortunately the Hook name is dying out because there was only my sister and myself, and so the Hook is dying out. And a lot of you will remember the Leyland clock on SHAP, which my dad used to wind up. I think it was erected sometime in about the 1930s, and he wound it up, and then eventually he handed it over to me. And when my children were little, I used to wheel the pram up and wind it up, and sometimes my husband perhaps did it, and all for £2 a year. And that was what my dad got when he first started winding the Leyland clock up. It had to be wound up once a week, and it was a good timekeeper, and it was really an advertisement for Leyland Motors. It had Leyland Motors written over the top, and William Potts of Leeds were the clockmakers, and the man that used to come to service it, he was Ivor Jones, and he used to come and stay with us overnight while he came to service the clock. And it was really a well-known landmark. A lot of you will also remember the Jungle Transport Cafe, which our house was between the Leyland clock and the Jungle Transport Cafe. And if we were directing anyone to our house, we used to say, our house is between the Leyland clock and the Jungle Transport Cafe, and it didn't matter whether they came from John O'Groats or Land's End, they knew where we were. And both those landmarks have gone now. So instead I have my little windmill outside, and it is nearly as famous as the Leyland clock.
Oh yes, I relied on the old Leyland clock and for timing as well, you know. Wherever you went, you only mentioned Leyland clock. Oh yeah, I remember that. It's on top of SHAP, isn't it? You know, everybody knew the Leyland clock.
The Leyland clock has been preserved and now stands, though not at its full original height, in the grounds of the Brewery Arts Centre in Kendal. "500 yards east of the old High Borough Bridge on the old road is Huck Bridge. The road comes steeply down to it. Then we go across and up the steep climb of Huck's Brow. Now we start the real climb up to the SHAP summit. This is where the lorries used to crawl in the busy days of the 40s, 50s and 60s. It's a climb of 2 miles to the summit. Now it's a 2-lane carriageway, but in the past it was a narrow road with a rock face on the right and a steep drop over the wall to the left.
This is the summit of SHAP on the A6 in the county of Westmoreland. People now call it these days Cumbria, but we prefer to call it Westmoreland. This memorial was erected to the drivers and crews of commercial vehicles which opened up the country from way back, and all the hardships the drivers and the people of SHAP also, who looked after the drivers when the very bad weathers. I mean, you could be cut off for up to 4 days at a time up here, snowbound, and you'd have to walk to SHAP village or Kendal, and there the local people would look after you. It's been erected by the Friends of the British Commercial Vehicle Museum in Leyland, and the SHAP Memorial Trust Fund was set up to maintain and erect this monument on the summit here.
The summit of SHAP is 1,397 feet above sea level. In this lay-by on the right, in the old days, there was a cafe which consisted of 2 single-deck buses back to back. Now we start our long descent towards SHAP village. The road takes a long sweeping right-hand bend, and as we descend we can see the pink granite quarry across the valley. And this is where the stone for the memorial came from. After the quarry, the road levels out through coniferous woods. We pass the yard of the SHAP Granite Company, and after this we come over the brow of the hill and parallel the West Coast Main Line Railway, which is climbed from Oxenholme above Kendal via the Loon Gorge and T-Bay en route to its own SHAP summit and Carlisle. The road and railway now run side by side to SHAP village.
I was born in SHAP, literally yards from the main A6 road, so the sound of the traffic has been part of my life right from as long as I can remember. I still live in the house where I was born, not in the very bad winter of 1947, but towards the end of the same year. But the 1950s, when I started school, just across the road here, it was SHAP Girls and Infants School, and there used to be a Belisha beacon and a crossing there because the boys' school was the opposite side of the road, and there used to be cross-travelling with the children. I think it would probably be about 1954 or 5 when they brought the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit in, and of course there went the Belisha beacons and the zebra crossing, and of course then it became a greater problem to cross the road. All the major towns in Scotland, the major cities, had holiday fortnights. Glasgow and Clydebank and Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen. And as one lot came down for a fortnight, they went to all these Lancashire resorts, Morecambe and Blackpool. And then a fortnight later, as they were coming back, another lot would be coming down, so you'd have two-way solid traffic. and it was nothing to wait 20 minutes to get across the road. But that was always one weekend when they had the village rose fete, which included a procession with a pipe band and floats, and it sort of caught a complete snarl up. But the collecting buckets were always full.
The system was that the drivers would, I suppose, head for Shap has been a reasonable place where they could park up easily, and there was quite a lot of industry in providing accommodation for lorry drivers. In fact, it was probably almost the prime occupation of people who had a fairly large house. The lorries themselves were parked up on the Memorial Hall and school fronts. Of course, I was only a little boy at the school, and when they started, particularly during the winter months, sometimes they had great difficulty in starting. There were fires and goodness knows what to as it were, decongeal the diesel, and the classroom, well, the whole school would fill up with diesel fumes, and it was absolutely impossible to see across the classrooms for this blue haze.
Shap village itself has grown up because of the road. I mean, there was a Shap village here centuries ago in medieval times related to the Shap Abbey and so on and so forth. So it has an ancient history. It's not just a ribbon development along a road which is no longer important. Shap is a long straggling village, but it's full of cheerful, friendly, helpful and hospitable people still. I mean, which harks back, I think, to those days of the original road. I think you must remember that when the A6 was an artery and all traffic was going in this constant stream against each other, it included all public and commercial transport and private transport as well. Of course, there weren't so many cars, there weren't so many motorbikes. Punctuated along the length of the A6 were a series of transport cafes, and of course, because the wagons travelled much slower in those days, and the heat in the cab was so oppressive often that you had to stop to let the whole thing cool down, wagon drivers tended by and large to use these transport cafes much more than they are perhaps used today, where they might make one stop, say, between Manchester and Glasgow. In those days they would make 3 or maybe 4 stops overnight. Cup of tea, break from the driving, from the heat of the cab and so on.
There was a transport cafe actually in the village, opposite the Memorial Hall, and it had a fair bit of parking behind it for quite a number of wagons. During the bad winters, of course, when it got blocked on top of the fell, everything backed up right through the village. And yes, stillness was one of the things you noticed, because you were used to the rumble of wagons, because it was all the heavy transport at night as a rule. And it was always very quiet, and I've seen it right through the village and out the other side. And of course, when I was at secondary school, we couldn't get to school. The buses couldn't get through. It was wonderful. You could have some days off. Shap became notorious for the snow and the blocking of the road. When you think about it, it really only affected a handful of days in the year. And yet that seemed to be the main thing. And I can remember the police used to be going up and down the village, and they used to manage to somehow miraculously get the lady that ran the old Red Wings cafe on the top of the fell, which was at that time 2 old buses back to back, used to manage to get her out of the village in a Land Rover up there, so that she could brew up and supply the needs of those who were stuck up right on the top of the fell. But I have been on the fell in blizzard conditions. It's a terrible experience. The snow will come horizontally, and it's really coming at such force, it's stinging. It's almost like a sandstorm, and very, very cold. You can hardly open your eyes to see what you're doing. So it must have been quite horrific for anyone who was up there. The WVS, which we had a group of ladies in that, and at the time it was quite a good group going, and they used to open up the Memorial Hall, and there was emergency sleeping facilities in there for the wagon drivers who stranded, and they used to put a soup kitchen on, such like. But anyone who had like a lady passenger, just cars. The police used to go around various houses and say, have you got a spare bed? You know, the ladies got the priority comfortable nights.
From the earliest motoring days onwards, any radio report about snow usually said SHAP is blocked, and just about everyone from Land's End to John O'Groats knew exactly what happened, that this pass through the Lake District had been closed.
And that 1962-3 winter was the worst one I can actually remember really well. But during the late 60s, after I left school and I was working in Kendal, they had what they called a night watch scheme running on the fell, whereby the council wagon with the grit used to go and park up on that lay-by on the top. As soon as it started to snow or freeze, it started spreading salt. And as a result, quite often they prevented the road being closed, because one of the worst places was the Demings on this side, going between the SHAP Pink Quarry and the summit. It's a very slow grind up there, and often it wasn't depth of snow so much as they articulated lorries jackknifing in slippery conditions. And once they got jackknifed across the road, nothing could get past them in either direction. So that was one of the major reasons why it used to get blocked.
When I was a little girl, all the traffic was stopped on SHAP, and they used to be stuck for about a week. And the drivers used to walk back down to the Jungle Transport Cafe and seek rest, you know, for the night. And then in the morning they used to wander back up and see if things had altered. But anyway, some three lads came, well, three drivers we thought they were, and they came to our house and said, could we put them up for the night? Well, my dad, our house wasn't as big then, and my dad said, well, I can't put you up in the house, but you can sleep on the brackens in the stable. So they thought that was great, and they brought some blankets in. Well, every morning, this was during wartime, they went out up SHAP to look at the lorries to see, and anyway, first day they came back with a nice big box of margarine. And my mother thought, and because she was feeding them, she was giving them slap-up breakfast, bacon, egg, and what have you. And she said, oh, where have you brought this from? They said, well, they'd brought it off the lorry. And she said, oh, well, thank you very much, it's wartime. And they said, you were feeding us. Next day they went out and they brought a box of sultanas in. And so my dad was getting a bit worried by this time. He said, are you doing right? I said, well, we've got to live off something. And the next day they went in and they brought something else in. I can't remember what it was, because I was only small then, and blankets and everything. Anyway, the thaw came and they eventually disappeared. Next caller we had was the police. Had we had three people staying with us? And we said, well, yes, we had. They said, well, they hadn't a lorry at all. They were raiding all the lorries of SHAP. So all these blankets were left, and those blankets were shared out between the police and us, and I think I still have one of those blankets today to remember them by.
Apparently the Americans were quite interested in this route during the war. Well, the fell being rather a torturous journey, particularly for heavily laden vehicles with rather inadequate brakes. And I imagine they must have had one or two heart-in-mouth moments. And they put forward a scheme to viaduct and tunnel, but for some unknown reason it was never taken up. However, at the end of the war, the Italian prisoners of war were drafted in vast droves and widened and straightened the road in a lot of places, and it hardly bears any resemblance to the earlier road, which was quite tortuous in its turns and gradients and one thing and another. So you can imagine, with the technology of the vehicles that were using it in those days, it must have seemed, in retrospect, doubly terrifying.
Well, it was a very narrow road, and of course the vehicles in those days, the maximum was 7'6", and that left you with 15 foot, and you probably had another foot. The road was probably about 16 foot wide, and of course the nightmare in those days of vehicles was there was no secondary braking. If you lost a vehicle, then you lost it. Whereas today vehicles have dead men and what have you, that if you have a broken pipe and your air drops, the brakes automatically lock on. So to that extent you have some degree of safety and a little bit of happiness as well, knowing that you have something to rely on. Not like the old vehicles where if the air dropped or the vacuum, if you burst the vacuum pipe, well, you could never hold them with a handbrake. The only way that you could hold them back was to make sure that you were down the box, because if you didn't, then you were using the foot brake all the time. And of course, just the same today as in those days, you get brake fade, and that was a rather serious business, because that was equal to probably losing your air or losing your vacuum. And when that happened, you had little hope of even holding them. So the answer was to be down the box and just brake, just check them occasionally, but never to keep your foot in the brake. But I've seen some, you know, that didn't realise what they were doing, and there was great plumes of smoke rising from the drums, and you couldn't get near them for hours after that for the smell of them.
Looking back, it was hard work, but then it wasn't, because you just took it all as granted. It was enjoyable in its way, but winter time was a bit rough, you know, and you got up there and probably the gritter hadn't been over, or no salt, you know. You had to start gritting to help each other along, and you always had your shovel in the lorry. You never set off without your shovel, never. You never went anywhere without your shovel. It was more important in your bait box with your shovel. At least you could get home. But it was slow, the old lorry. It was, you know, 26 mile an hour, absolutely stood on the pedal, you know. And, not much comfort. Cold, drafty. But it was still all right. But it used to take you, well, about 25 minutes from Leyland Clock up to the top of Hooks there, up to Red Wing Snack Bar. And winter time it wasn't so bad, but summertime it had its hazards because of the overheat. You got up there and boiling, you had to stop and let it cool off a bit before you dare go any further, you know.
When I unveiled the plaque on top of SHAP, of course we had the vintage vehicles, you know, the rally, and they all lined up on the top of SHAP, and it was a picture to be seen. There were 3 deep on the lay-by on the top of SHAP. And I told all my stories of all the accidents which had happened on SHAP. And my favourite one is when the whiskey wagon went over Hooks Bridge into the bottom. And, there was whiskey galore. I mean, the river was frozen over with ice, and there was whiskey bottles sliding on the ice, and they were all in the shipyards, in the broken glass. And we had lots of callers to see, and the police were there, and the customs were there, and in the end they got my husband with the tractor and link box to cart this whiskey out. Well, I've never seen anything like it. When we got into bed at night, he smelt of whiskey, and it was laughable because he didn't like whiskey until then. So he's enjoyed whiskey ever since, and our tractor, it smelt of whiskey for weeks after. In fact, I made people laugh when I said it nearly ran on whiskey.
Here are some photographs of typical accidents on SHAP over the years.
Well, in the old days, I mean, the traffic, it just never stopped. And in fact, at night, it was noisier at night. When I had visitors staying, if they had the windows opened, they thought it was terrible, really. Because, as I say, it was busier at night than through the day. But once the motorway had opened, it opened at 1:30 one day, and within the first half hour, it just went absolutely dead. And as I say, we couldn't sleep at night until we got used to it. And that was how we used to know it had snowed during the night in the olden days, because everything suddenly went quiet, and because the noise had gone, because all the traffic was stopped, that used to waken us up, and we used to think, oh, it must have snowed.
Well, the whole thing wasn't a sudden activity. It wasn't a sudden change from motorway or from high road to motorway. The whole thing happened in a series of fragmented jerks. I mean, the first thing that happened was that they built a bypass round Preston. And of course, once you got on this Preston bypass, it was whoopee, no speed restrictions, so everybody had their clog hard down. And gradually, of course, the whole of these bypasses of the northern towns were linked together, and this became the M6. But it was whoopee on the bypasses before the whole thing was strung together as one major road.
Her husband, on waking up one morning, turned to his wife and said, "Is it snowing?" And she said, "No, why?" He said, "Well, the stillness is absolutely incredible." And she said, "Oh, you silly thing, the motorway opened yesterday. It's, this is what we're going to enjoy." Which was the case. And immediately prior to this section of the motorway opening, it all sort of shot off the end of the existing M6 down about Preston, and it all found its way nose to tail over the fell and through Shap, and in fact quite a lot of the elderly people just daren't cross the road. Some of them hadn't seen their across the road neighbour for goodness knows how long. It was probably only at the dead of night they set out. There's a story actually which is relevant to the 40-mile speed limit, which a lot of people raise an eyebrow at, and apparently this stems from the fact that we had a quite celebrated police sergeant resident here, and it was his theory that if the speed was up to 40 miles an hour, at least it would keep moving, because it used to more or less grind to a halt, particularly during the Glasgow and Edinburgh holiday weekends, which was something to be seen. I'll tell you, there's coaches intermingled with the haulage vehicles and private cars as well. And really it was a case whereby they probably tried to stop here but weren't able to by virtue of the fact that it was a moving traffic jam.
Well, to me, it's a lovely road now. It's nice when all the heavy traffic's gone off onto the motorway, and if you're travelling from Kendal to Shap and wanting to get onto the motorway, I mean, there are 3 other alternatives, but you definitely must come the Shap Road. It's the most scenic view, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. And me, having never lived anywhere else here all my life, I just can't imagine living anywhere else. And we have such a social life out in the country. A lot of people that stay with me say, "How on earth do you exist out in the country?" And then we begin to talk, and we are doing far more out in the country socially than they are. They don't speak to their next door neighbour. My nearest neighbour down the road is a mile, but that was them going past just now. And there's never a day passes but we're in contact with them, and we know what one another's doing. Yeah, and it's just a lovely place to live, and nice now with the road when it's so quiet.
You had to be a very resilient person, especially in those days. You didn't phone for tyre services or anyone else. You had to get buckled in. In those days there was a great deal of comradeship, and as much as anybody that was in difficulty, help was at hand. And more than one hand. You could get half a dozen drivers stopping, even although they weren't needed, they would at least stop and say, "Can I help?" Whereas nowadays that wouldn't even be considered. And I think it's because most drivers now have to keep to timetables, and they don't have time to worry about whether someone's in trouble or not in trouble.
The pace of life was slower. People were nicer to each other, I think. I broke down a number of times once I got my own vehicle on the old A6, and can remember wagon drivers stopping, getting down. "What's the matter with you, lad? You some help or something?" I mean, you couldn't possibly envisage that happening today. We've become, of course, a nation of transported people, and we're rather indifferent, I think, to anyone else who's on the road. It was a camaraderie, not just between the wagon drivers, but also between any motorist for that matter. And you even got salutes from the AA man on his motorbike. It was all rather special. In fact, setting out on a journey was a rather special activity. You look forward to it. I mean, you didn't view it with horror as you do today, but it's very dear to my heart, is the old A6 and so on. And now, of course, it's really a by-road, hardly used, because all the heavy traffic's taken on the new M6.
Well, I admire the shop people because they used to do a tremendous amount for it, and the police as well, and the Westmoreland County Council workmen, whilst it was often blocked. They did their best, you know, everybody round about. You were never stuck because anybody would lift a hand and help you. No, the shop people, they were noted for it as well. You got talking to somebody on the docks at Liverpool from well, up in Scotland, you know. Oh, yeah, unfortunately at the stage shop last week or a fortnight ago, and, oh, the people were lovely and all this, you know. And everybody knew shop. What a grand place. But them were the good old days, I think. Or the bad old days, whichever way you look at it, but they were good. They were good.
If I were asked today which era I would rather drive in, I'd rather go back to the olden days, because everybody had time to do their work and at the same time speak to others, and when you were in trouble everybody was there, and for that reason I would rather go back to the old days.
Where the A6 memorial was erected was more or less on the point of the one-time boundary between England and Scotland. It would be the fact that the fell would be off-putting towards forces coming to sort of invade one way or the other. Nobody in their right mind would want to go any further. When you said, where do you come from, and you said Shap, oh, they said that place is always cut off in winter. Or that terrible hill where, you know, it's way out in the wilds somewhere. And so really I suppose it owes its fame to notoriety rather than anything else, which is a pity really, because it's quite a charming place.
I'll give you this verse of this little old poem. On the roof of England, up above the map, stands a lonely village, sturdy little Shap, in the breezy cloudland, level with the fells, where the lordly summits guard the ancient wells. Window deep in roses stands the cottage panes, sprayed with moorland waters, cool in summer rains. Light and heart and footstep is thy boon to me, let thy praise be heard on roads that lead to thee.